From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Ahead today from the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock will provide this week's cattle market analysis. She'll cover last Friday's USDA cattle on feed report, and Katelyn talks about the improvement in cattle feeding cost of gain, which may affect calf marketing decisions this fall. Then we'll meet new K-State veterinary entomologist Cassandra Olds. She'll talk about her plans for researching insect-borne disease issues in Kansas cattle production, including something she's studied extensively in the past, diseases vectored by ticks, such as anaplasmosis. And K-State's Charlie Lee talks this week about the eyesight of farm pond fish. All that here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, Amber Alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
You are listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. As always, good to have you aboard the day after the Memorial Day break, and we'll bring you now the weekly cattle market segment. In view of the fact we weren't with you yesterday, joining us now is the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center in Denver, Katelyn McCullock, to cover a variety of things. Katelyn, let's start with the standard recap of the trading week just passed. Cash-fed cattle trade seemed to be holding firm. What's your read on that?
Well, the negotiated fed cattle market seems to have improved substantially from where we were maybe just a couple weeks ago. I'm looking at Friday's market right now, and it looks like we traded all grades in the 116 range. That's a market improvement from the below dollar prices we had not that long ago. Deferred futures contracts still look to be quite low. Not a lot of optimism showing there at the end of last week, and we'll talk about this when we cover cattle on feed, but it's looking a little bit better for the fourth quarter for cattle feeding margins.
But it really is interesting to continually watch the cash trade at such a premium to the futures.
Yes, and on the other side of that, feeder cattle prices were mostly softer in the southern plains. We've been trading somewhere for 600 to 700 pounds, anywhere from the high 130s to low 140s. 800 to 900 pounds have been 110 to 122 over the last several weeks. And so those haven't necessarily been moving quite in tandem with those fed cattle prices either.
Well, let's visit as well about the boxed beef trade. Of course, that's been a story among many of late, the lofty levels that trade has reached in recent weeks, but those prices are starting to ease back some.
So choice boxed beef last week fell from the previous week down to $4.05 per hundredweight, and all the values across the primals decreased, at least on a week-over-week basis. And the largest fall was in chuck and rounds, both decreasing over $75 per hundredweight on a weekly average basis. Now, that's for those choice values. Now, the cutout is expected to fall alongside with slaughter increasing, and so that's some of what you're seeing is just the increase in availability. A lot of that tightness over the last 6 weeks has primarily been caused by that pinch point in the supply chain, so we'd expect that to, as that pinch point eased up, that cutout values will probably ease further. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the event, if you want to call COVID-19 a singular event, before that, we never saw choice box beef values on a weekly basis average above $300, let alone $400 a hundredweight. And last week was the third straight week choice box beef has been over $400 per hundredweight. And even select cutout values have hit the 400s a couple weeks out of the last 6. So interesting times for sure.
But the decline here should be interpreted as a factor of resumption of closer to normal beef processing as opposed to a decline in demand. Is that a fair statement?
That would be correct. So a lot of the run-up we saw, as well as the decline we're going to see, is going to be related to those slaughter levels. Grocery store sales were still very strong in April, and we'd expect them to be fairly strong in May as well, as people are still largely stuck at home to eat. But the dynamic is going to change as we see restaurants open up. You'll see different primal values will probably move around quite a bit as restaurant demand is for different types of cuts in general. And it'll largely depend on how fast people go out and eat at those restaurants and at what capacity those restaurants can operate on. We are seeing some uptick in buying as folks plan for those reopenings. I would suspect they need to plan ahead for that day to come when they're allowed to serve customers. And so it's not as clear cut as saying one will go up and the other will go down. I still think there's the potential to have some volatility within different primal cuts or within different wholesale cuts moving forward. But in general, I think you'll see downward price pressure on the cutout value.
And before we move on, Katelyn, to that cattle on feed report, what is the latest progress update on the resumption of beef processing activity? The slaughter volumes are gradually building back up, it appears.
So beef, pork, and chicken slaughter rates have all improved. This week's estimated slaughter put the number of cattle being sold over 500,000 head. The monthly NASS livestock slaughter report also came out last week. So federally inspected cattle slaughter for April, so these are the official numbers for the April data, was down more than 20%. And all classes of cattle have rather large declines with the exception of dairy cows. So dairy cow slaughter was actually up in the month of April about 4%. And that's really because of the large declines we've seen in milk price over the course of the last 4 months. Dairy consumption has been hit rather hard with the absence of food service and restaurant sectors operating. A lot of butter and cheese moved through that, as well as a lot of fluid demand through schools. Now that should ease up as retail food service opens. And fluid has benefited from folks staying home, eating more cereal, just generally buying more milk, but it's probably not enough to make up for the loss of consumption we've had over the last couple of months.
Cattle on Feed report issued this past Friday, Katelyn. Well, it was widely anticipated that placements would be down as of May the 1st because of all that's gone on, and that was confirmed in the report.
I would characterize the cattle on feed report as expected. You know, cattle on feed levels fell to 95% of a year ago on May 1, and the slaughter plant disruptions were evident in almost every piece of data we got out of that report. Marketings were down about 24% from last year, and placements were significantly hung back as a result of the uncertainty in this market. This is the second month in a row that placements were down more than 20% below 2019 figures for the same month. And all weight categories saw year-over-year declines, but the 7 to 799 pound placement category was hit especially hard. U.S. total declined about 30% from last year, and Texas was even larger, down almost 40% for that weight category. Kansas feedlots appeared the most optimistic, or at least the most willing to place at that point in time, and out of all the states that are detailed in that report, and their total placements were only 18% below a year ago, so a little different than maybe the U.S. picture. When we look at some of the fundamentals of what's happening on the cattle feeding side, a big part of that is where break-evens are. Mm-hmm. So April break-evens for cattle coming out of the feedlots were estimated to be as high as $115 to $117, and that was probably a far cry from the prices they actually received for those cattle. Now the outlook has really improved, and a lot of that is because feedstuffs are declining along with the slaughter plants opening back up, and so you'll have more demand for fed cattle. But the projections for those feedlot costs, Kansas State University, Eric's very own, releases KSU feedlot data on a monthly basis. And those March cost of gains were put at about $83 per hundredweight. And April's projections have declined significantly, so to $74 per hundredweight. And that's the lowest since 2018. So a lot of that is based on those feed costs coming down. In addition to, you're going to see better prices, hopefully, here for fed cattle. Now, the Livestock Marketing Information Center estimates break-evens for cattle placed in April to be about $97 to $98 a hundredweight when they come out probably this fall. The current futures price trading Friday afternoon for October was $99, so that indicates a small margin possibly available currently for those cattle. Now, feed costs, of course, largely depend on weather. The WASDE has penciled out a record high corn yield of 178 bushels per acre on 97 million acres of corn planted. That picture is going to true up as we move through the season, but today that looks like a very large carryout number of over 3 billion bushels in the 2021 marketing year, and that level is expected to leave a dramatic reduction in corn costs. If you look at just Omaha prices over the last couple of weeks, we've already been below $3 a bushel. They did pick up last week to be just above $3, but all of those point to improving situations for cattle feeders.
And as an addendum to that, and you do point this out in the article on the lmic.info website on the feeding cost of gain, when producers look ahead, especially those with stockers out on grass, maybe even cow-calf operations, you say that in view of what's happening with feeding cost of gain, thinking retained ownership over once again might be something to consider later on down the line.
So over the last couple of months, it's been really difficult to lay off risk, and retained ownership is one of those ways you can do that, in the sense that you don't have to take the price today. You can hopefully get a better price later on. As we see most of these conditions look like improving situations later on, I think it makes sense to at least look at it for today, if not look at some of the projections that are out there for what you could possibly market those cattle on for later on. And I think retained ownership can start to make sense in a lot of ways.
You might want to have a look at that article, by the way, on the lmic.info website. Katelyn, it's safe to say as we finish out here that we've some interesting dynamics going on in these markets right now.
You know, normally, Eric, we'd be talking about Memorial Day and what that means for grocery store sales and folks grilling at home. Most states are slowly opening back up, but I think the social aspect is one that's still uncertain on how it's going to impact behavior, particularly as it pertains to meat consumption.
And again, we always appreciate your insight on what's happening in the cattle trades. Katelyn, we'll talk again in a few weeks. Thanks.
Thank you.
She's the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center out in Denver, which is co-sponsored by, among other land-grant universities, Kansas State University. Katelyn McCullock with us, and you're listening to Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. It's our opportunity now to introduce to you the newly named veterinary entomologist at Kansas State University. And as the title would imply, she'll be working directly on problems associated with insects as they might affect livestock and other animals. And Cassandra Olds is her name. We're speaking with her for the first time. So, Cassandra, thanks for joining us, and welcome to K-State, as you've been on board just a matter of a handful of weeks now, right?
Yes, it's a wonderful time to get started. It's different, but I'm having a blast, and everybody has been so fantastic and welcoming that Manhattan's home already, and it's only been a few weeks, so I'm really happy to be here. And thanks for having me on your show.
You bet. Background on your experiences in this field, and you have a considerably deep level of experience in this, so tell us about it.
Yeah, so I grew up in South Africa, and I always grew up with this background of the diseases that insects transmit and arthropods, and I'd always had a deep love of animals. So when I went to university, I somehow found a way that I could marry these two together. And so I got into this field through primarily looking at the pathogens that they transmit and what these pathogens do to the animals that they infect. And so then while I was doing this, I sort of gotten bitten by the bug, as one would say, and I became very interested more so in the arthropods, and arthropods are ticks and mites and then insects. Insects have 6 legs and arthropods have 8 legs. So I got interested in the general field, and that's where my career took me. I spent my PhD investigating anti-tick vaccines. I did this at the International Livestock Research Institute in Nairobi, Kenya. And that was an absolutely fantastic experience. And so my background has been primarily on cattle and the ticks that are a pest of these cattle and the diseases that they transmit. And now that I'm here, I'm still going to continue working on ticks and the diseases that they transmit. It changes focus a little bit. The disease that I worked on previously does not occur in the United States, so there's no point in me really working on it here, but anaplasmosis is very similar. It's also a tick-borne disease. And so a lot of the experience and the research knowledge that I have from a different tick, different parasite combination can be moved over to anaplasmosis. So I'll be doing some stuff on tick control, anaplasmosis stuff. But then I'm also very excited to be branching out into a new area, which is flies. Biting and non-biting flies. I have heard from multiple people that they're a problem in Kansas. And so I'll be moving on to doing some research on that, not only the fly side, but also the pathogens that they transmit. So at the moment, it's really just getting in touch with the various stakeholders, finding out what their real problems are, what the needs are, and then finding out how I can align my research to best meet those needs and hopefully help out some producers, solve some problems with insects and ticks.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned anaplasmosis. That has become a prevalent problem for cattle producers in this state, seemingly on an accelerated basis. You've had experience with a like disease. As you look at where we're at with dealing with ticks as a vector here, are there any solutions to curbing that transmission, curbing either the tick activity or its ability to transmit? Where are we at with that?
You know, the problem with tick-borne diseases, research in general, is that we're, in a lot of ways, we're so far behind the other diseases. When I look at the body of knowledge we have for malaria and mosquitoes, just in terms of just mosquito biology, fundamental questions about mosquito biology, we just know so much. When I go and look for the same kind of literature or information in the tick field, it's almost non-existent. But for a long time, we've been able to manage them with caricides and pesticides. So treatment of the whole herd just gets rid of the ticks in the area. And for a long time, it's worked really well. So there's a problem with this being that we now have resistance to these caricidal compounds, and it's getting worse and worse. This is just a natural. The moment you have an acaricide, you're starting to select for resistance. It's just the way of the world. But this has been accelerated in many regions because people haven't been using acaricides correctly. So if you don't have the formulation correct, if you don't store it properly, the active ingredients in the acaricide degrades and they're no longer as potent, and that selects for resistance. So we have a problem now that a lot of our methods of control are no longer effective. And then also we have the knock-on effects of the environmental status. These compounds are pretty toxic. So generally, we've been trying to move away from the use of these toxic compounds and developing better methods of tick control. One of the methods is anti-tick vaccination, which I've worked on for a long time. The problem with anti-tick vaccination is that what we do when we use vaccination for ticks, we actually are using a protein or a compound that the ticks naturally have, and we're producing that artificially, introducing it into the animal. The animal then develops an antibody response to this compound, which is similar to the antibody response you get when you get a flu virus or coronavirus for that matter. And then when a tick feeds on this animal, theoretically, the antibodies end up attacking the tick and the tick dies. But the problem is that ticks have so many redundant pathways for any one thing that they do. So, for example, one of the things that they do is they inhibit the itch response so that the cattle host or the human doesn't realize that the tick's there and it stops self-grooming. And so you think, oh, great, I've got a great candidate. If the itch response is gone, then the immune response will kick in, and fantastic. But the only problem is that it's so redundant that if you vaccinate against one version of these proteins that stop the itching, there's 3 or 4 lined up to take its place. So the problem has been really identifying candidates that will make effective vaccines. So we're still a long way away from that. And even if we do get one, it's all a matter of time before the ticks start developing alternative ways to get around that. So for the moment, all we have is acaricides. I keep telling people just use them sparingly but effectively. So, wait for tick burden. If you've got 1 or 2 ticks, rather just leave them and wait till you have higher numbers. So it's all about managing how many ticks you have on your premises, on your animals. It's my personal opinion that sometimes a few ticks are a good thing. If you have a few number of ticks, it means a lower level of parasites that they transmit. So if you can develop, and it's a term we use in the veterinary field called endemic stability. So what it means is if animals have a low burden of parasites or pathogens, then the immune response can naturally take care of it, which make them better able to encounter a more virulent strain or something like that. So sometimes in an area, if you are in an area where anaplasmosis is endemic, which means that no matter what you do, you are going to get anaplasmosis, having a very strict tick eradication campaign means that you'll actually have calves who aren't necessarily protected. And then if you get a breakthrough because let's say you all of a sudden have selected for resistance, then you're actually in a worse situation than you would have been if you had a lower level of tick challenge. So it's a little bit tricky because it's not a one-size-fits-all situation, but keeping tick levels low but not entirely absent is my opinion, is possibly the best way. It's a tight balancing trick that you've got to work on, because you don't want too many, but you don't want too few. But complete eradication is not always the best thing. The other thing is also just making sure that you don't use the same kind of acaricide time after time after time, because that also selects for resistance. So if you swap them out, you use them properly, swap them out so that you're using different acaricide types each time, that can really help prolong the amount of time that you can use these compounds for. And there is a modified anaplasmosis vaccine that's available, but it's an experimental vaccine. So right now we don't have a good, widely available vaccine for anaplasmosis. But I read a report that said that it's present in all the counties in Kansas now anyway. So, if you have a herd where your dams have had exposure to anaplasmosis, then through passive transfer of maternal antibodies to their calves, they have a little bit of protection. And then while they're still with their moms in that critical period, if then they get exposure to anaplasmosis through natural tick transmission, they actually develop a pretty robust immune response to it. And that's the sort of the natural endemic system that is the most robust kind of system that we can hope for.
Cassandra, if a producer, as they listen to your plans, your intent for your work here at K-State, and if they have some ideas on things they'd like to see the university study in this field, can they contact you directly?
Oh, yes, please do. I strongly encourage anyone to just reach out to me. Feel free to send me an email. That's colds@ksu.edu. So it's colds. Easy one to remember. So feel free to shoot me an email anytime. And I'd really love to hear from you guys and find out what you really need, because I'm only going to be successful if I'm doing something that is going to help you guys out. So please let me know what you need done. colds.ksu.edu is her email address. Cassandra, welcome, and we will talk again soon. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
She's the newly assigned veterinary entomologist at Kansas State University, Cassandra Olds, and she's been our guest on this part of Agriculture Today. We'll return after this break over the K-State Radio Network.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Agriculture Today is back now on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. And now with today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, today, the USDA begins accepting applications from you crop growers and livestock producers for that $16 billion in aid under the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. The USDA's Gary Crawford has more.
Sign up for the direct producer payment portion of the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, or CFAP, will start on Tuesday. And as to the sign-up process,
we're going to make it as easy as we can for producers.
Undersecretary of Agriculture Bill Northey says you can go into the farmers.gov CFAP website, get a lot of information on the program and the application process, including a useful video.
We will have an actual form that will be on there and a calculator, a payment calculator as well, where folks can go in, be able to see in the boxes what they need to put in there. We'll go ahead and pre-calculate the payment, and then it'll populate a form.
It will not automatically send the form into the Farm Service Agency, though.
But folks can either email it in or send it in or drop it by the county office.
Again, for all the information, go online to farmers.gov/CFAP. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And with further detail here under CFAP, once the USDA determines a producer's payment, the department will make a payment of up to 80% of the total within a week. Another 20% will be held back for later in the summer. Now, applications will be accepted through August the 28th. Commodities that did not suffer a 5% or greater price decline from mid-January to mid-April are not eligible for CFAP. Specifically, this would include hard red winter wheat, white wheat, extra long staple cotton, alfalfa, and forage crops, among other commodities. China is importing U.S. agriculture and other goods a bit slower than originally hoped for, but the Phase 1 Trade Pact is still being successfully implemented. That according to National Economic Council Director Larry Kudlow. Last week, he said that China is not currently looking to renegotiate the trade pact, saying that's not happening. He said, quoting Kudlow, "We're looking for steady implementation and will be monitoring it very closely." The USDA and U.S. Trade Representative said in an update that Beijing is making progress despite difficult times for both countries, with agricultural purchases, exemptions on retaliatory tariffs, and approvals of more U.S. exports of farm products. Kudlow acknowledged commodity purchases are a little behind because of poor economic conditions, but the president's advisor said he is still satisfied with the overall China compliance with the agreement. Want to remind you one more time that the Agronomy Department here at Kansas State University will be sponsoring and hosting its first ever live virtual wheat field day. And that's coming up the next two nights, Wednesday and Thursday evening, the 27th and the 28th. And K-State Research and Extension will be conducting this live on YouTube, updating you growers and others on the most recent crop advances and challenges. Separate programs for each evening, beginning at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening with the first, ending at 9 o'clock, and there'll be a number of topics to be covered. You can find the YouTube live links at KSU Wheat on either Facebook or Twitter, KSU Wheat, Facebook or Twitter, or you can contact K-State's Ramalolo Lolato at ksu.edu. We do hope you wheat producers can take in one or both of those programs tomorrow night and Thursday night. Now it's on to this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning June and that it is Dairy Month. So, what do you have planned? I know many of you would host events on your dairy farms in the past. With the issues with COVID-19, some on-farm events may be very difficult in some places and maybe something that even this year you would not consider on your dairy. So what are you going to do to help your neighbors and people in your community celebrate Dairy Month with you? Just wanted to give you some things to think about. You know, as we look at all the things we're doing by distance, there's some things that you could do either on Facebook or some sort of social media platform, or maybe even a website if you have one for your farm. Or if you don't, maybe this is a good time to develop that website and start putting some information out there about your industry. Remember that if you do that, particularly if you're going to put photos or videos out there, that people really love to see calves and kids. And as you think about things around your farm that you might share, you might want to think about that as you think about photos or videos that you might want to record and post to those. as you show those photos of maybe some calves or maybe your own children caring for animals around the farm, make sure you take time to tell your story about your dairy and what you're doing to supply wholesome dairy products in the grocery store. It's a very important message that we need to continue to put in front of people, making sure that you also talk a little bit about what you do with animal health and animal care, as that's always a concern for people as they watch these sorts of things. Some of you may be saying, well, I'm kind of the generation that we didn't use a lot of PowerPoint slides. We didn't do a lot of video. Well, guess what? The younger generation is an excellent source of help to help you get those done. So you might want to turn to the younger generations around your farm and see if they'd be willing to help with that. They might actually like a project like that as they look for things to do during this time as well. Make sure that you get everyone in the dairy involved, even employees. It's important to let them know that you're doing things to try to help people understand what's going on the dairy farm. Lastly, just want to share a couple of other ideas with you that you could do to help celebrate June is Dairy Month. How about your local food bank? Maybe you could sponsor some milk for a week or other dairy products. You also might want to think about some of your local restaurants. Maybe you have a local ice cream store in town, or maybe a local burger place. You could supply cheese for the cheeseburgers, or maybe a discount, or maybe even free ice cream for a short period of time one day during the week. If you have other neighbors that are also dairy farmers, you guys might go together to do something like that. Again, it promotes a local business. It also promotes dairy products. So good thing to do. So as you think about what you might do for supporting Dairy Month this June, make sure that you think about what you could do in your community to promote dairy products and consumption of dairy products, as well as what you're doing on your farm to make sure that we have wholesome products in the store. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And this is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Closing out this Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today, it's our weekly visit with Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension Wildlife Specialist. Charlie, you're going to provide information that may be unfamiliar to a lot of folks about the nature of fish vision. Of course, that differs considerably from what we're accustomed to as humans. Let's talk about the biology of that here.
Well, it's been a question of what fish actually see, has been, and frankly still is a challenging one for scientists. There's been numerous studies on the character and structure of fish eyes, but it's not really known exactly what image their brain is seeing. But the knowledge about a fish's sense of vision comes from physical examination of the parts of their eyes and studies of how the fish respond in the laboratory to various images, colors, and other sight stimuli. They've got a very sophisticated systems of vision, which they can use to distinguish prey. They can also see in low light conditions, in dirty and murky water. They actually have very good contrast detection. They're very quick to pick up motion, so have good motion perception, and the ability to get a very clearly focused image. But in general, most fish are nearsighted, although some folks believe that there are some species of sharks that are farsighted.
The way that the fish eye is affixed on the fish itself, does that create blind spots, so to say?
Well, of course, when you think that fish don't have necks, so they can't turn their heads independently of their body, so they wouldn't be very efficient swimmers if they had to move the front part of their body to see. They can rotate their eyes without moving their head, so then each eye has almost 180-degree vision of the fish's surroundings, and they can also scan up and down. So that gives fish a wide lateral field of vision, but many of them have blind spots immediately in front of and behind them, as you suggested.
But you say they have other senses that allow them to compensate for that.
Yes, although the vision is a very important sense for most animals, in some fish it's less important than their sense of smell or their use of their lateral line. Fish use their sense of smell or hearing to help them detect and find food. Then they use their eyesight to guide them on that final attack. Some movement of the prey is usually what is necessary to trigger or provoke that attack. Most predatory fish are very curious and examine almost anything that comes through their field of vision. And other scientific studies have shown that predatory fish get agitated and excited by movement in the water.
That's some background on the nature of fish vision, how all of that relates to actually fishing, and that is attracting fish to your bait. This ties into all sorts of bait options that people have considered for time unending, Charlie.
That seems to be the key thing that you hear fishermen talk about. Well, what are they biting on today? And if we knew the answer to that and it was solely just a couple of lures or a couple of colors, there wouldn't be the well-stocked tackle shops that you see in many locations. There's lots of shapes and diversity of colors and color patterns that suggest, depending upon the species and the conditions, you got to have the right shape and the right color to be successful. And I'm not sure that's always the case, but there are some generalities that are important here when we talk about color. The colors definitely become darker in deep water, but blue keeps its color longer than any other, which probably is one of the reasons it's a favorite color for people that are fishing somewhere in waters that are less light penetration. Also, colors appear different in turbid water, and those lure colors change with depth. In clear water, about 10 feet, the fish that are near the surface in clear water see true colors, somewhat similar to the way we see them. But in murky water, the effects of depth and turbidity in the water are evident in that most of the lures start seeing to be a darker color. So we know that there are colors that appear to be preferable to some species. It's very difficult to test for that. I did see a report where they interviewed fishing guides to ask them their favorite colors. I believe they interviewed 44 different fishing experts, and in clear water, 14 of those 44 experts voted a solid white was the best of any color, either a solid or pattern color. The next closest was 2 or 3 votes out of the 44. So a total of 23 of those experts went pure white or a white pattern. One of the favorite colors that I use is chartreuse. It did not get a single vote in clear water, although blue and silver and blue and white together were picked by 6 pros. In murky water and in low light, again white was the winner, although it was a slimmer margin, with only 15 of the experts liking that solid white or white with another color. So I don't know that there's a favorite color. There are colors that I'm confident that work better at times than they do at others. Perhaps I've not studied enough to know which one are most important, but I do try to go light when the water is not clear and bright, and then go a darker color when the water is more murky or I'm fishing deeper.
In that fish are adept at picking up motion, would the action of the lure be more important than color?
I think that that's probably what matters most. I think it's the lure type and the action, the size and the swimming depth, not really color that's most important. I've not kept meticulous catch records, nor have I seen that in scientific literature. But I'm confident that most of the fish that we're catching, their attack mode is often initiated by motion, and I think a little bit of motion on the end of that line is certainly going to increase the likelihood of your being able to capture a fish, although there's probably a percentage of the time that color can make a difference. But I don't know if there's any particular easy rules about which colors are going to work best.
Well, knowing a little bit about fish vision may help one succeed at a greater level with their fishing when they decide on lures and other bait. And Charlie, as always, we appreciate the input. Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And our time's away for today. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.